Drop the flowers or step back right now. The command cut through the cold afternoon air so sharply that even the rustling flags seemed to fall silent. More than 200 mourners stood gathered beneath a pale Virginia sky at Arlington National Cemetery, their dark coats moving gently in the breeze, while rows of white headstones stretched across the rolling hills like an ocean of stone. At the center of it all, beside a flag-draped casket, a black woman remained motionless. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. She simply held a bouquet of white lilies against her chest and looked down at the casket before her. Officer Ethan Walker tightened his grip on the authority he believed belonged to him. Assigned to security detail for one of the most prestigious military funerals of the year, he had spent the morning directing guests, checking credentials, and making sure nobody crossed the restricted perimeter. From where he stood, the woman looked out of place. Her black coat was elegant but simple. She wore no visible military insignia, no medals, no rank, no entourage, just a grieving face and a small boy standing quietly beside her. "Ma'am, this area is restricted," Ethan said firmly. Several heads turned. The conversation stopped. The military honor guard remained perfectly still, yet the woman did not move. She reached down and gently rested one hand on the shoulder of the boy beside her. The child could not have been older than 8. He held a folded photograph against his chest with both hands. "I only came to say goodbye," the woman said softly. Her voice carried no anger, only sadness. The answer somehow irritated Ethan even more. Rules were rules. Procedures were procedures. Important people were arriving every minute. Television crews waited beyond the security barriers. Senators, generals, and senior officials filled the front rows. In Ethan's mind, the situation was simple. This woman had crossed a line she wasn't supposed to cross. Around them, the late autumn wind swept across the cemetery, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and damp earth. The sound of distant bugles echoed faintly across the grounds. Still, the woman remained where she was, standing beside the casket as though nothing else in the world mattered. Ethan stepped forward. The polished badge on his uniform caught a flash of sunlight. "Ma'am, I'm asking you one last time." The little boy looked up nervously. Several mourners exchanged uncomfortable glances. A few people quietly reached for their phones. Yet the woman never looked at Ethan. Her eyes remained fixed on the folded American flag resting atop the casket. For a brief moment, something about her calmness unsettled the crowd. Most people would have explained themselves. Most people would have stepped away. Most people would have tried to avoid attention. She did none of those things. Instead, she slowly knelt beside the casket and carefully placed the white lilies near the flag. The cemetery fell silent. Ethan felt every eye shift toward him. He had no idea that within the next hour, the entire nation would learn the name Maya Brooks, and that the woman he believed didn't belong there was, in fact, the most important person at the funeral. Maya Brooks remained kneeling beside the casket for several seconds after placing the lilies down. The wind tugged gently at the edge of her coat, while the little boy beside her shifted closer, pressing the old photograph against his chest. Most people at the funeral did not know who she was. To them, she looked like a grieving daughter who had arrived quietly and somehow wandered into a restricted section. That assumption followed her everywhere. Maya had learned long ago that people often noticed her skin color, her age, or her simple appearance before they noticed anything else. The boy standing beside her was her grandson, Noah, 8 years old, curious, kind, and far too familiar with military funerals for a child his age. He looked up at her with worried eyes. "Grandma, are we in trouble?" he whispered. Maya placed a hand on his shoulder and offered a small smile. "No, sweetheart. We are here for your great-grandfather." Noah nodded and looked back toward the casket. The photograph he carried showed a younger man standing proudly in uniform decades earlier. The corners were worn from years of being handled. The man in the picture was Colonel James Brooks, a decorated war hero, respected by thousands of soldiers and remembered by generations of military families. To Noah, however, he was simply Great-Grandpa James, the man who taught him how to tie fishing knots and always carried peppermint candy in his pocket. The crowd surrounding the ceremony continued to grow. Black sedans rolled slowly along the cemetery roads. Men and women in dark suits stepped out and took their places. Senior military officers arrived one by one. Some wore rows of ribbons across their dress uniforms. Others carried themselves with the quiet confidence that came from decades of service. Yet Maya stood alone. No entourage followed her. No aide surrounded her. She preferred it that way. Years earlier, she had learned that rank could create distance between people. Today was not about rank. It was about family. Near the rear of the gathering, two elderly veterans noticed her. One leaned toward the other. "That woman looks familiar," he murmured. His friend narrowed his eyes. "I was thinking the same thing." Neither could place her immediately. Time had changed faces. Gray hair had replaced black. Years had added wisdom and quiet strength. Meanwhile, Officer Ethan Walker watched from several yards away. Something about the situation continued to bother him. The woman had not acted nervous. She had not tried to explain herself. She had not asked for permission from anyone. Instead, she carried herself with a calm certainty that seemed completely out of place. Across the cemetery, church bells rang softly in the distance. Sunlight slipped through the clouds and illuminated the rows of white headstones stretching across the hillside. Maya looked down at the folded flag resting atop her father's casket. Her eyes softened. For a brief moment, the noise of the crowd disappeared. The arriving dignitaries disappeared. Even the tension surrounding her faded away. All she could see was her father teaching her to ride a bicycle on a dusty Georgia road, cheering at her graduation, and saluting her for the very first time after she earned her commission. She took a slow breath. What she did not know was that several of the most powerful people in Washington were already on their way to the ceremony, and every one of them had come because of her. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than 15 minutes, yet the atmosphere across the cemetery had already begun to change. Vehicles bearing government plates rolled slowly along the winding roads between the headstones. Men and women carrying earpieces spoke quietly into microphones hidden beneath their collars. Reporters who had arrived expecting a respectful military funeral suddenly found themselves repositioning cameras and checking notes. Something unusual was happening. Officer Ethan Walker noticed it too. From his post near the restricted section, he watched as a black SUV stopped near the front entrance. A senior military officer stepped out wearing a dark blue dress uniform decorated with rows of ribbons that caught the afternoon sunlight. Moments later, another vehicle arrived. Then another. High-ranking officials rarely appeared at the same funeral unless the deceased had left an extraordinary legacy. Ethan glanced toward the program folded in his hand. Colonel James Brooks. Decorated veteran. Community leader. Respected officer. The description seemed impressive, but not enough to explain the growing list of distinguished guests. Nearby, several members of the honor guard exchanged quiet observations. One soldier whispered that officials from the Pentagon had arrived. Another mentioned seeing congressional staff members taking their seats. A third pointed toward a distant row where retired generals were gathering together. The realization spread slowly through the crowd. This was no ordinary funeral. Meanwhile, Maya stood quietly beside Noah. The boy shifted his weight and looked around with wide eyes. He had never seen so many uniforms in one place before. Gold insignia gleamed beneath the sun. Polished shoes reflected light across the grass. Flags moved gently above the rows of chairs arranged before the casket. Noah tugged softly on Maya's sleeve. "Grandma, why are there so many important people here?" Maya looked down at him and smiled. "Because your great-grandfather spent his life serving others." Noah nodded thoughtfully. The answer seemed enough for him. He looked back at the photograph in his hands and carefully brushed a speck of dust from its surface. Several yards away, a retired general suddenly froze while scanning the crowd. His eyes settled on Maya. For a brief moment, he appeared uncertain. Then recognition crossed his face. He straightened immediately. The veteran standing beside him noticed the change. "What is it?" he asked. The retired general continued staring toward Maya. "I do not believe it," he murmured. Before he could explain further, another group of officials arrived, drawing attention away from the moment. Ethan remained focused on maintaining order. The growing presence of powerful guests only reinforced his confidence that security protocols mattered. Every movement now felt important. Every person had to be accounted for. Yet something continued to bother him about the woman near the casket. She did not behave like someone overwhelmed by the attention surrounding the event. She stood with quiet composure. Her posture remained steady. Her eyes never searched the crowd for approval. Instead, She seemed completely uninterested in the influential figures arriving around her. The late afternoon sun slipped through a break in the clouds, casting long shadows across the hillside. The brass instruments of the military band reflected warm flashes of light. A hush slowly settled over the gathering as more guests took their seats. Then, from the entrance road, a convoy unlike any before it appeared. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Even seasoned officials stood straighter. Whatever uncertainty remained about the significance of this funeral vanished instantly. And as the vehicles approached, several people who recognized Maya Brooks began to realize that the most important arrival of the day had actually been standing beside the casket all along. The convoy came to a slow stop along the cemetery road, and an almost invisible wave of attention moved through the crowd. Reporters lowered their voices. Military officers adjusted their posture. Even the wind seemed quieter as doors opened one after another. No one noticed the change immediately. "Grandma, why is everyone looking over there?" he asked. Maya followed his gaze but did not answer right away. She already knew many of the people stepping from those vehicles. Some she had worked beside for years. Others she had advised during international crises that never appeared in newspapers. Yet none of that mattered today. Today she was simply a daughter saying goodbye to her father. Across the gathering, Officer Ethan Walker observed the reactions with growing concern. The arrival of so many senior officials meant every security decision would be scrutinized. He glanced again toward Maya and noticed something that deepened his suspicion. Several high-ranking officers had begun looking in her direction. A few appeared surprised to see her standing there. In Ethan's mind, that only confirmed that something was unusual. He started walking toward her position once more. Nearby, two event coordinators quietly reviewed the seating arrangements. One of them suddenly looked confused. "There should be a reserved place in the front row," she whispered. Her colleague checked the printed program. Then his eyes widened. "Not the front row," he replied. "The center position." The woman blinked. "The center position is reserved for." He stopped speaking and looked toward Maya. Before either could finish the conversation, a retired four-star general stepped away from the crowd and began moving toward the casket. Several people immediately recognized him. Cameras shifted in his direction. The general walked with measured confidence until he stopped only a few feet from Maya. For a moment, neither spoke. Then the elderly officer offered a respectful nod. "It is good to see you again," he said quietly. Maya returned the gesture. "I wish it were under different circumstances." The general's expression softened. "Your father was one of the finest men I ever served with." Noah watched the exchange carefully. The old officer smiled warmly at the boy. "And you must be Noah." The child looked surprised. "You know my name?" The general chuckled. "Your grandmother talks about you more than you realize." Several nearby guests exchanged puzzled looks. They could hear the respect in the officer's voice. They could see it in the way he addressed Maya. Yet many still did not understand who she was. Ethan noticed the interaction as well. Instead of easing his concerns, it made him even more determined to enforce the boundaries he believed were necessary. Important guests were arriving faster now. Senior officials continued taking their seats. Members of the press whispered among themselves. The atmosphere felt increasingly tense, as though the entire ceremony were moving towards something nobody could yet see. Then another black vehicle arrived. This time, the reaction was immediate. Military personnel stood straighter. Conversations ended mid-sentence. Several officers instinctively turned toward the road. Even the retired general beside Maya looked surprised. Whoever had just arrived carried a level of influence that commanded attention from everyone present. And as the passenger door slowly opened, Maya finally lifted her eyes from the casket and realized the day was about to change forever. The passenger door opened, and a ripple of recognition moved through the crowd almost instantly. Conversations stopped. Reporters straightened. Senior officers exchanged quick glances. The Secretary of Defense stepped out onto the cemetery road, followed by several aides. The sight alone was enough to confirm what many had already begun to suspect. This funeral carried significance far beyond the ordinary. Yet what happened next confused even the most experienced observers. Instead of heading directly toward the front row reserved for government officials, the secretary paused and scanned the gathering as though searching for someone. Officer Ethan Walker noticed it immediately. His attention sharpened. Around him, security personnel adjusted positions while guests stood respectfully. The secretary began walking across the grass, bypassing senators, retired commanders, and decorated veterans. His destination appeared unmistakable. He was heading toward the casket, more specifically, toward Maya Brooks. The realization unsettled Ethan. The woman he had spent the last hour questioning now seemed to be attracting the attention of the most influential people at the ceremony. Still, he refused to believe he had misjudged the situation. Rules existed for a reason. Appearances could be deceptive. He stepped forward again. "Ma'am, I need you to move behind the designated family area," he said firmly. Several nearby guests turned toward him. Noah looked up nervously. Maya remained calm. She glanced toward the approaching officials, then back at the casket. "I am already where I need to be," she replied quietly. Ethan frowned. The answer sounded respectful, yet it carried a certainty that irritated him. Before he could respond, a military protocol officer hurried over. The man looked anxious. "Officer, perhaps we should wait a moment," he suggested carefully. Ethan shook his head. Security procedures apply to everyone. The protocol officer opened his mouth as if to say more, then stopped. The secretary continued approaching. Behind him came senior military leaders, congressional representatives, and advisors whose faces frequently appeared on national television. Cameras began turning toward Maya. Reporters whispered questions into microphones. The atmosphere felt charged, as though the entire event had shifted onto an invisible edge. Noah moved closer to his grandmother. "Why are they coming here?" he asked softly. Maya looked down at him. Her expression remained gentle despite the growing attention surrounding them. "Because they came to honor your great-grandfather," she said. The boy nodded, though uncertainty still lingered in his eyes. A cool breeze swept across the hillside. Hundreds of small American flags fluttered among the rows of white headstones. Sunlight broke through the clouds again, casting a warm glow across the folded flag resting atop Colonel Brooks's casket. For a brief moment, Maya closed her eyes. The sounds of the gathering faded. She remembered her father's voice telling her that true leadership was never about recognition. It was about service. Around her, however, recognition was rapidly becoming unavoidable. The Secretary of Defense was now only yards away. Senior officers followed behind him with visible respect. Several veterans had already risen from their seats. Even those who did not yet know Maya's identity could sense that something extraordinary was unfolding. Ethan stood frozen between certainty and doubt. For the first time that afternoon, he began to wonder whether the woman he had repeatedly challenged was not a visitor who had crossed a boundary at all. Perhaps she was the very reason so many powerful people had gathered there in the first place. The Secretary of Defense finally reached the casket and stopped. For a moment, the entire cemetery seemed suspended in silence. No speeches, no announcements, no movement beyond the soft flutter of flags across the hillside. Maya stood beside her father's casket with Noah at her side, while hundreds of eyes remained fixed on the scene unfolding before them. The secretary removed his gloves slowly and looked at the folded flag resting atop the casket. His expression carried none of the formality people expected from a public official. Instead, there was something deeply personal in his eyes. "Colonel Brooks was a remarkable man," he said quietly. Maya nodded. He was. The simple exchange carried more weight than any prepared speech. Around them, reporters lowered their microphones. Even the cameras seemed less important than the moment itself. The secretary glanced toward Noah and smiled warmly. "Your great-grandfather changed a lot of lives, young man." Noah looked down at the photograph he still held. "He changed mine too." The answer drew gentle smiles from several nearby veterans. Then silence returned. A cool breeze drifted through the cemetery. The late afternoon sunlight softened as clouds moved slowly across the sky. Maya looked toward the rows of white headstones stretching across the hills. Each stone represented a story, a sacrifice, a family. Her father had taught her to respect that long before she ever wore a uniform. She remembered standing beside him as a teenager during another funeral decades earlier. She remembered asking why soldiers saluted people they would never meet. His answer had stayed with her ever since. Because service is not measured by who remembers your name. It is measured by what you leave behind. The memory settled quietly in her heart. Beside her, Noah slipped his small hand into hers. She squeezed it gently. The noise of the crowd seemed distant now. The tension that had filled the afternoon no longer mattered. Neither did the confusion. Neither did the assumptions people had made when they first saw her arrive. What mattered was the man lying beneath the flag. A father, a mentor, a patriot. Several feet away, Officer Ethan Walker stood motionless. For the first time all day, he stopped focusing on procedures and credentials. Instead, he watched the woman beside the casket. The calmness she carried suddenly felt different to him. It was not defiance. It was not arrogance. It was dignity. The kind that required no explanation. The kind that existed whether anyone recognized it or not. The military band waited quietly in the distance. Sunlight reflected from polished brass instruments. The honor guard remained perfectly still. The scent of fresh grass mixed with the cool autumn air. Everything felt strangely peaceful. Then the secretary turned slightly and looked toward the approaching senior military leaders gathering behind him. Several of them had expressions of deep respect. One carried a ceremonial folder. Another held a folded document bearing an official seal. Maya noticed them and immediately understood what was coming. The crowd did not. But within moments, everyone present would learn a truth that would transform the entire ceremony and leave many people questioning everything they thought they knew about the woman who had arrived carrying nothing more than a bouquet of white lilies and the quiet strength of a daughter saying goodbye. The senior military leaders stopped several feet behind the Secretary of Defense and formed a quiet line of their own. The movement immediately drew attention from every corner of the cemetery. Reporters lifted cameras. Veterans exchanged curious glances. Even those who had arrived knowing very little about Colonel James Brooks could feel that they were witnessing something extraordinary. One of the officers stepped forward carrying the ceremonial folder. The gold seal on its cover caught the fading sunlight. He opened it carefully, then looked directly at Maya. "Ma'am," he said respectfully, his voice carrying across the silent gathering. "The Department of Defense wishes to formally recognize your father's lifetime of service and sacrifice." Maya nodded once. Her expression remained calm. Noah squeezed her hand a little tighter. The officer continued. "Colonel James Brooks dedicated his life to this nation, but today we also honor the family that carried forward his legacy." The crowd listened closely. Some people shifted forward in their seats. Others remained frozen in place. The officer turned slightly toward the assembled guests. "Many of you knew Colonel Brooks. Some served beside him. Others benefited from his leadership. But there is another legacy connected to his name." He paused. The silence deepened. Then he looked back at Maya. "General Maya Brooks, thank you for your continued service to the United States of America." The words landed like a sudden wave moving through the crowd. Gasps echoed across the cemetery. Several reporters immediately lowered their cameras in disbelief before raising them again. Veterans who had recognized her earlier slowly stood to their feet. Senior officers straightened instinctively. Noah looked up at his grandmother with a proud smile. The truth had finally been spoken aloud. Maya Brooks was not merely a grieving daughter standing beside the casket. She was one of the most respected military leaders in the country. The retired four-star general who had greeted her earlier stepped forward and rendered a formal salute. Another followed. Then another. Within seconds, dozens of military personnel stood honoring her service. Officer Ethan Walker felt the blood drain from his face. The realization struck him all at once. Every assumption he had made throughout the afternoon collapsed under the weight of reality. The woman he had repeatedly questioned. The woman he believed did not belong. The woman he had treated as an outsider. She was the very person many of the nation's most powerful officials had come to see. Around him, people began whispering her name. Some recognized her from international news coverage. Others remembered her leadership during humanitarian missions and military operations overseas. One reporter quietly spoke into a microphone. "General Maya Brooks, one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Armed Forces, has been standing here the entire time." The Secretary of Defense stepped forward again. This time he did not speak immediately. Instead, he extended his hand. Maya accepted it. "Your father would be proud of you," he said. For the first time that day, emotion flickered across her face. She glanced down at the flag-covered casket and took a slow breath. The autumn wind moved gently through the cemetery. Hundreds of small flags fluttered among the headstones. The sunlight softened into a warm golden glow. And standing only a few yards away, Officer Ethan Walker realized that the story of this funeral was no longer about a misunderstanding. It was about a truth that the entire nation was about to witness. The ceremony continued, but the atmosphere had changed completely. What had begun as a solemn farewell had become something far larger. News crews transmitted live updates. Social media clips recorded by attendees spread across the country within minutes. The image of General Maya Brooks standing quietly beside her father's casket appeared everywhere. Yet Maya paid no attention to any of it. Her focus remained where it had always been, on the man who had shaped her life. As military honors proceeded, the Secretary of Defense took his seat among the other officials. The senior officers who had gathered around Maya returned to their places as well. Respect had been shown. Recognition had been given. The moment belonged once again to Colonel James Brooks. Noah stood proudly beside his grandmother. Every few minutes he glanced toward the rows of distinguished guests, still amazed by how many important people seemed to know her. Nearby, Officer Ethan Walker remained unusually quiet. The confidence that had guided him earlier in the afternoon had been replaced by a growing sense of discomfort. He replayed every interaction in his mind, every assumption, every conclusion he had reached before knowing the truth. The weight of it settled heavily on his shoulders. Several members of the security team exchanged brief looks. They had seen everything unfold. No one said a word. The silence spoke loudly enough. When the final ceremonial remarks concluded, guests slowly began standing from their seats. Small groups formed throughout the cemetery. Veterans shared memories of Colonel Brooks. Former colleagues spoke about his leadership. Families gathered near the pathways between the headstones. The golden light of late afternoon stretched across the hills, painting long shadows across the grass. Maya remained near the casket long after many guests had started leaving. She listened patiently as people approached to offer condolences. Some she knew well. Others were complete strangers whose lives her father had touched decades earlier. Each story revealed another piece of the man she had loved. A retired sergeant spoke about a letter Colonel Brooks had written to his family during a difficult deployment. A nurse described how he had quietly funded scholarships for military children. An elderly veteran wiped tears from his eyes while recalling a friendship that had lasted more than 40 years. Noah listened to every story. With each one, his great-grandfather seemed to become larger than life. As the crowd gradually thinned, Officer Ethan Walker finally approached. His steps were slow, uncertain. The confidence from earlier was completely gone. Maya noticed him coming, but said nothing. He stopped several feet away. The breeze moved softly through the cemetery. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan lowered his eyes. "General Brooks," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Maya studied him calmly. There was no anger in her expression, no satisfaction, only the same dignity she had carried all day. Ethan swallowed hard. "I judged you before I knew who you were." Maya glanced toward her father's casket before looking back at him. The fading sunlight reflected softly across the folded flag. "The truth is," she said gently, "you should not have needed to know who I was." The words were not harsh. They were not spoken to embarrass him, yet they landed with more force than any accusation could have. Ethan stood silently, understanding exactly what she meant. And in that quiet moment among the rows of white headstones, he realized the lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. 1 year later, the cemetery looked almost the same. The rolling hills remained covered with rows of white headstones. American flags moved gently beneath a clear autumn sky. The air carried the familiar scent of fresh grass and fallen leaves. Yet for Maya Brooks, everything felt different. She walked slowly along the stone pathway with Noah beside her. The boy was taller now. His stride carried more confidence. In one hand, he held a small bouquet of white lilies. In the other, he carried the same worn photograph of Colonel James Brooks that he had brought to the funeral a year earlier. They stopped in front of the headstone and stood quietly together. No reporters were present. No officials. No cameras. No speeches. Only the soft sound of wind moving through the trees beyond the cemetery. Noah carefully placed the flowers at the base of the stone. Then he stepped back and looked up at his grandmother. "I still think about him a lot," he said. Maya smiled softly. "So do I." The boy stared at the name engraved in the stone. "People still tell stories about him." Maya nodded. "That means he left something good behind." Noah seemed to think about that for a moment. The sunlight reflected across the polished surface of the headstone. Somewhere in the distance, a bell rang softly. The sound drifted across the hills and disappeared into the afternoon air. Maya lowered herself onto a nearby bench. For the first time in many months, there were no meetings waiting for her. No briefings. No flights. No schedules demanding her attention. There was only this place and the memories it held. She remembered her father teaching her that character revealed itself most clearly when nobody was watching. She remembered him reminding her that dignity did not come from titles, uniforms, or recognition. It came from how people treated others when they believed those others had nothing to offer them. The lesson felt even more meaningful now. Noah sat beside her. "Grandma." "Yes." "Do you think great-grandpa would be proud?" Maya looked toward the headstone. The breeze lifted a few strands of silver hair from her face. For several seconds, she said nothing. Her eyes reflected both sadness and gratitude. Then she reached over and gently squeezed Noah's shoulder. The boy followed her gaze toward the endless rows of white markers stretching across the hills. Each one represented a life, a family, a story, a legacy. The wind moved through the flags again, creating a soft rustling sound that seemed to travel across the entire cemetery. Maya closed her eyes briefly and listened. In that quiet moment, she felt the same peace she had felt beside her father's casket 1 year earlier. Not because the world had finally recognized her, not because people had learned her rank, but because the values her father had lived by continued to endure. Noah leaned against her shoulder. Together they sat in silence as the afternoon sun slowly lowered across the horizon. The golden light touched the headstone, the flowers, and the small photograph resting beside them. Nothing more needed to be said. The flags continued to move gently in the wind. The sky glowed with the last warmth of the day. And somewhere within that silence, the legacy of Colonel James Brooks lived on.